Welcome to the Quiet Corner Bedtime Stories. I'm Annie, and along with my co-host Amon, we're here to share our favourite classic stories, accompanied by soothing music to help you relax, unwind, and drift off into a peaceful night's sleep. If you enjoy our stories, please like, subscribe, and leave a rating or review on your favourite podcast platform. You can also support us on Lenny FM along with some of your other favourite podcasts, or make a donation to Ko-Fi, kofi.com, so we can continue to share these classic stories with you all. Thank you for all your support and sweet dreams.
Welcome to the Quiet Corner. I'm Amon, and tonight I'll be reading you The King of the Foxes from the great tales of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The King of the Foxes. It was after a hunting dinner, and there were as many scarlet coats as black ones around the table. The conversation over cigars had turned, therefore, in the direction of horses and horsemen, with reminiscence of the phenomenal runs where foxes had led the pack from end to end of a county, and had been overtaken at last by 2 or 3 limping hounds and a huntsman on foot, while every rider in the field had been pounded. As the port circulated, and the runs became longer and more apocryphal, until we had the whips inquiring their way and failing to understand the dialect of people who answered them, the foxes too became more eccentric, and we had foxes up pollard willows, foxes which were dragged by the tail out of horses' mangers, and foxes which had raced through open front doors and gone to ground in ladies' bonnet boxes. The master had told 1 or 2 tall reminiscences, and then he cleared his throat for another, and we were all curious, for he was a bit of an artist in his way, and produced his effects in a crescendo fashion. His face wore the earnest, practical, severely accurate expression which heralded some of his finest efforts. "It was before I was master," said he. "Sir Charles Adair had hounds at the time, and then afterwards they passed to old Latham, and then to me. It may possibly have been just after Latham took them over, but my strong impression is that it was in Adair's time. That would be in the early 70s. About 72, I should say. The man I mean has moved to another part of the country, but I dare say that some of you can remember him. Danbury was his name. Walter Danbury, or Wat Danbury as the people used to call him. He was the son of old Joe Danbury, of High Ashcombe. When his father died he came into a very good thing, for his only brother was drowned when the Magna Charta floundered, so he inherited the whole estate. It was but a few hundred acres, but it was good arable land, and those were the great days of farming. Besides, it was a freehold, and a yeoman farmer, without a mortgage, was a warmish man before the great fall in wheat came. Foreign wheat and barbed wire, those are the 2 curses of this country, for one spoils the farmer's work, and the other spoils his play. This young Wat Danbury was a very fine fellow, a keen rider, and a thorough sportsman, but his head was a little turned at having come, so young, into a comfortable fortune, and he went the pace for a year or 2. The lad had no vice in him, but there was a hard drinking set in the neighbourhood at the time, and Danbury got drawn in among them. And being an amiable fellow who liked to do what his friends were doing, he very soon took to drinking a great deal more than was good for him. As a rule, a man who takes his exercise may drink as much as he likes in the evening, and do himself no very great harm, if he will leave it alone during the day, that is. Danbury had too many friends for that, however, and it really looked as if the poor chap was going to the bad, when a very curious thing happened which pulled him up with such a sudden jerk that he never put his hand upon the neck of a whisky bottle ever again. He had a peculiarity which I have noticed in a good many other men, that though he was always playing tricks with his own health, he was none the less very anxious about it, and was extremely fidgety if he ever had any trivial symptom. Being a tough, open-air fellow, who was always hard as a nail, it was seldom that there was anything amiss with him. But at last the drink began to tell, and he woke one morning with his hands shaking and all his nerves tingling like overstretched fiddle strings. He had been dining at some very wet house the night before, and the wine had perhaps been more plentiful than choice. At any rate, there he was, with a tongue like a bath towel and a head that ticked like an 8-day clock. He was very alarmed at his own condition, and he sent for Dr. Middleton of Ashcombe, the father of the man who practises there now. Middleton had been a very great friend of old Danbury's, and he was very sorry to see his son going to the devil, so he improved the occasion by taking his case very seriously, and lecturing him upon the danger of his ways. He shook his head and talked about the possibility of delirium tremens, or even of mania, if he continued to lead such a life. What, Danbury was horribly frightened. "Do you think I am going to get anything of the sort?" he wailed. "Well, really, I don't know," said the doctor gravely. "I cannot undertake to say that you are out of danger. Your system is very much out of order. At any time during the day you might have those grave symptoms of which I warn you." "You think I shall be safe by evening?" asked Danbury. "If you drink nothing during the day and have no nervous symptoms before evening, I think you may consider yourself safe," the doctor answered. A little fright would, he thought, do his patient good, so he made the most of the matter. "What symptoms may I expect?" asked Danbury. "It generally takes the form of optical delusions." "I see specks floating about?" "That is mere biliousness," said the doctor soothingly, for he saw that the lad was very highly strung, and he did not wish to overdo it. "I dare say that you will have no symptoms of the kind, but when they do come they usually take the shape of insects or reptiles or curious animals." "And if I see anything of the kind?" "If you do, you will at once send for me," and so, with a promise of medicine, the doctor departed. Young Wat Danbury rose and dressed, and moped about the room feeling very miserable and unstrung, with the vision of the county asylum for ever in his mind. He had the doctor's word for it that if he could get through to the evening in safety, he would be all right. But it is not very exhilarating to be waiting for symptoms and to keep on glancing at your bootjack to see whether it is still a bootjack or whether it has begun to develop antennae and legs. At last he could stand it no longer, and an overpowering longing for the fresh air and for the green grass came over him. Why should he stay indoors when the Ashcombe hunt was meeting within half a mile of him? If he was going to have these delusions which the doctor talked of, he would not have them the sooner nor the worse because he was on horseback in the open. He was sure, too, that it would ease his aching head. And so it came about, in about 10 minutes he was riding out of his stable-yard with his roan mare Matilda between his knees. He was a little unsteady in his saddle just at first, but the farther he went the better he felt, until by the time he reached the meet his head was almost clear, and there was nothing troubling him except for those haunting words of the doctor's about the possibility of delusions any time before nightfall. But soon he forgot that also, for as he came up the hounds were thrown off, and they drew the gravel hanger and afterwards the hickory corpse. It was just the morning for a scent, no wind to blow it away, no water to wash it out, and just damp enough to make it cling. There was a field of 40, all keen men and good riders, so when they came to the black hanger they knew that there would be some sport, for that's cover which never draws blank. The woods were thicker in those days than now, and the foxes were thicker also, and that great dark oak grove was swarming with them. The only difficulty was to make them break, for it is, as you know, a very close country, and you must coax them out into the open before you can hope for a run. When they came to the black hanger, the field took their positions along the cover side, wherever they thought that they were most likely to get a good start. Some went in with the hounds, and some clustered at the ends of the drives, and some kept outside in the hope of the fox breaking in that direction. Young Wat Danbury knew the country like the palm of his hand, so he made for a place where several drives intersected, and there he waited. He had a feeling that the faster and the farther he galloped, the better he should be, and so he was chafing to be off. His mare, too, was in the height of fettle, and one of the fastest goers in the country. Wat was a splendid lightweight rider, under 10 stone with his saddle, and the mare was a powerful creature, all quarters and shoulders, fit to carry a life guardsman. And so it was no wonder that there was hardly a man in the field who could hope to stay with him. There he waited and listened to the shouting of the huntsmen and the whips, catching a glimpse now and then, in the darkness of the wood, of a whisking tail, or the gleam of a white and tan side amongst the underwood. It was a well-trained pack, and there was not so much as a whine to tell you that 40 hounds were all working around you. And then suddenly there came one long-drawn yell from one of them, and it was taken up by another, and another, until within a few seconds the whole pack was giving tongue together and running on a hot scent. Danbury saw them stream across one of the drives and disappear upon the other side, and an instant later the 3 red coats of the hunt servants flashed after them upon the same line. He might have made a shorter cut down one of the other drives, but he was afraid of heading the fox, so he followed the lead of the huntsmen. Right through the wood they went, in a bee-line, galloping with their faces brushed by their horses' manes as they stooped under the branches. It's ugly going, as you know, with roots all wiggling about in the darkness, but you can take a risk when you catch an occasional glimpse of the pack running with a breast-high scent. So in and out they dodged until the wood began to thin at the edges, and they found themselves in the long bottom where the river runs. It is clear going there upon the grassland, and the hounds were running very strong about 200 yards ahead, keeping parallel with the stream. The field, who had come around the wood instead of going through, were running hard over the fields upon the left. But Danbury with the hunt servants had a clear lead, and they never lost it. 2 of the field got on terms with them. Parson Geddes on a big 17-hand bay, which he used to ride in those days, and Squire Foley, who rode as a featherweight and made his hunters out of the cast of thoroughbreds from the Newmarket sales. But the others never had a look-in from start to finish, for there was no check and no pulling, and it was clear cross-country racing from start to finish. If you had ever drawn a line straight across the map with a pencil, you couldn't go straighter than that fox ran, heading for the South Downs and the sea. And the hounds ran as surely as if they were running to view, and yet from the beginning no one ever saw the fox, and there was never a hallo forward to tell them that he had been spied. This, however, was not surprising, for if you've ever been over that line of country you will know that there are not very many people about. There were 6 or 7 of them in the front row, Parson Geddes, Squire Foley, the huntsman and 2 whips, and Wat Danbury, of course, who had forgotten all about his head and the doctor by this time, and had not a thought for anything but the run. All 6 were galloping just as hard as they could lay hooves to the ground. One of the whips dropped back, however, as some of the hounds were tailing off, and that brought them down to 5. Then Foley's thoroughbred strained herself, as these slim-legged, dainty, fetlocked thoroughbreds will do when the going is rough, and he had to take a back seat. But the other 4 were still going strong, and they did 4 or 5 miles down the river flat at a rasping pace. It had been a wet winter, and the waters had been out a little time before, so there was a great deal of sliding and splashing, but by the time they came to the bridge the whole field was out of sight, and these 4 had the hunt to themselves. The fox had crossed the bridge, for foxes do not care to swim in a chilly river any more than humans do, and from that point he had streaked away southward as hard as he could tear. It was broken country, rolling heaths down one slope and up the other, and it's hard to say whether the up or the down is more trying for the horses. This sort of switchback work is all right for a cobby, short-backed, short-legged little horse, but it is killing work for a big, long-striding hunter, such as the one that one wants in the Midlands. Anyhow, it was too much for Parson Geddy's 17-hand bay, and although he tried the Irish trick, for he was a rare keen sportsman, of running up the hills by his horse's head, it was all to no use, and he had to give up. So then there was only the huntsman, the whip, and Wat Danbury, all going strong. But the country got worse and worse, and the hills were steeper and more thickly covered in heather and bracken. The horses were over their hocks all the time, and the place was pitted with rabbit holes. But the hounds were still streaming along, and the riders could not afford to pick their steps. As they raced down one slope, the hounds were always flowing up the opposite one, until it looked like that game where one figure in falling makes the other one rise. But never a glimpse did they get of the fox, although they knew very well that he must only be a very short way ahead for the scent to lie so strong. And then Wat Danbury heard a crash and a thud at his elbow, and looking around he saw a pair of white cords and top boots kicking out of a tussock of brambles. The whip's horse had stumbled, and the whip was out of the running. Danbury and the huntsman eased down for an instant, and then seeing the man staggering to his feet all right, they turned and settled into their saddles once more. Joe Clark, the huntsman, was a famous old rider, known for 5 counties around, but he reckoned upon his second horse, and second horses had all been left many miles behind. However, the one he was riding was good enough for anything with such a horseman upon his back, and he was going as well as when he started. As to Wat Danbury, he was going even better. With every stride his own feelings improved, and the mind of the rider has an influence upon the mind of the horse. The stout little roan was gathering up its muscular limbs under it, and stretching to a gallop as if it were steel and whalebone instead of flesh and blood. Wat had never come to the end of his powers yet, and today he had such a chance as testing them as he had never had before. There was a pasture country beyond the heather slopes, and for several miles the two riders were either losing ground as they fumbled with their crop handles at the bars of the gates, or gaining it again as they galloped over the fields. Those were the days before this accursed wire came into the country, and you could generally break a hedge where you could not fly it, so they did not trouble with the gates more than they could help. Then they were down in a hard lane, where they had to slacken their pace, and through a farm where a man came shouting excitedly after them, but they had no time to stop and listen to him, for the hounds were on some ploughland, only 2 fields ahead. It was sloping upwards, that ploughland, and the horses were over their fetlocks in the red soft soil. When they reached the top they were blowing badly, but a grand valley sloped before them, leading up to the open country of the South Downs. Between there lay a belt of pine woods, into which the hounds were streaming, running now in a long straggling line and shedding one here and one there as they ran. You could see the white and tan dots here and there, where limpers were tailing away. But half the pack was still going well, though the pace and distance had been tremendous. 2 clear hours now without a check. There was a drive through the pinewood, where a horse can get the last yard out of itself, for the ground is hard enough to give him clean going, and yet spongy enough to help him. Wat Danbury got alongside the huntsman, and they galloped together with their stirrup irons touching, and the hounds within 100 yards of them. "We have it all to ourselves," said he. "Yes, sir, we've shook them off the lot of them this time," said old Joe Clark. "If we get this fox, it's worth while having him skinned and stuffed, for he's a curiosity, he is." "It's the fastest run I ever had in my life," cried Danbury. "And the fastest that I ever had, and that means more," said the old huntsman. "But what licks me is that we've never had a look at the beast. He must leave an amazing scent behind him, for those hounds can follow him like this, and yet none of us have seen him when we've had a clear half-a-mile view in front of us." "I expect that we'll have a view of him presently," said Danbury, and in his mind he added, "At least I shall." For the huntsman's horse was gasping as it ran, and the white foam was pouring down it like the side of a washing tub. They had followed the hounds to one side of the tracks which led out of the main drive, and that divided into a smaller track still, where the branches swished across their faces as they went, and there was barely room for one horse at a time. Wat Danbury took the lead, and he heard the huntsman's horse clumping along very heavily behind him, while his own mare was going along with less spring than when she had started. She answered to a touch of his crop or spur, however, and he felt that there was something still left to draw upon. And then he looked up, for there was a heavy wooden stile at the end of the narrow track, with a lane of stiff young saplings leading down to it, which was far too thick to break through. The hounds were running clear upon the grassland on the other side, and you were bound either to get over that stile or to lose sight of them, for the pace was too hot to let you go around. Well, Wat Danbury was not the lad to flinch, and at it he went at full sprint, like a man who means what he is doing. She rose gallantly to it, and rapped hard with her front hoof upon it, and shook him to her withers, recovered herself, and it was over. Wat hardly got back into his saddle when there was a clatter behind him like the fall of a woodstack, and there was the top bar in splinters, the horse on its belly, and the huntsman on his hands and knees, half a dozen yards in front of him. Wat pulled up for an instant, for the fall was a smasher, but he saw old Joe spring to his feet and get to his horse's bridle. The horse staggered up, but the moment it put one foot in front of the other, Wat saw that it was hopelessly lame. A slipped shoulder and a 6 weeks' job by the look of it. There was nothing he could do, and Joe was shouting at him not to lose the hounds, so off he went again, the one solitary survivor of the whole hunt. When a man finds himself there, he can retire from fox hunting, for he has tasted the highest which it has to offer. I remember once when I was out with the Royal Surrey, but I'll tell you that story afterwards. The pack, or what was left of them, had got a bit ahead during this time, but he had a clear view of them on the downland, and the mare seemed to be full of pride at being the only one left, for she was stepping out rearly and tossing her head as she went. There were 2 miles over the green shoulder of a hill, a rattle down a stony, deep-rutted country lane, where the mare stumbled and nearly came down, a jump over a 5-foot brook, a cut through a hazel copse, another dose of heavy ploughland, and a couple of gates to open, and then the green, unbroken downs beyond. "Well," said Wat Danbury to himself, "I'll see this fox run into, or I shall see it drowned, for it's all clear going now between this and the chalk cliffs which line the sea." But he was wrong in that, as he speedily discovered. In all the little hollows of the downs at that part, there were little plantations of fir woods, some of which have grown to a good size. You do not see them until you come upon the edge of the valleys in which they lie. Danbury was galloping hard over the short springy turf when he came over the lip of one of these depressions, and there was the dark clump of wood lying in front of and beneath him. There were only a dozen hounds still running, and they were just disappearing amongst the trees. The sunlight was shining straight upon the long olive-green slopes which curved downwards into this wood, and Danbury, who had the eyes of a hawk, swept over this great expanse, but there was nothing moving upon it. A few sheep were grazing far up to the right, but there was no other sight of any living creature. He was certain then that he was very near to the end, for either the fox must have gone to ground in the wood, or the hounds' noses must be at his very brush. The mare seemed to know what this great empty sweep of countryside meant, for she quickened her stride, and a few minutes afterwards Danbury was galloping into the fir wood. He had come from the bright sunshine, but the wood was very closely planted, and so dim that he could hardly see to the right or to the left out of the narrow path down which he was riding. You know what a solemn churchyardy sort of place a fir wood is. I suppose that it is the absence of any undergrowth and the fact that the trees never move at all. At any rate, a kind of chill suddenly struck Wat Danbury, and it flashed through his mind that there had been some very singular points about this run. Its length and its straightness, and the fact that from the first no one had ever caught glimpse of the creature. Some silly talk which had been going around the country about the king of the foxes, a sort of fox demon, so fast that it could outrun any pack, and so fierce that they could do nothing with it if they overtook it, suddenly came back into his mind, and it did not seem so laughable now, in the dim fir wood, as it had done when the story had been told over wine and cigars. The nervousness which had been on him in the morning, and which he had hoped that he had shaken off, swept over him again in an overpowering wave. He had been so proud of being alone, and yet he would have given £10 now to have Joe Clark's homely face beside him. And then, just at that moment, there broke out from the thickest part of the wood the most frantic hullabaloo that he had ever heard in his life. The hounds had run into their fox. Well, you know, or you ought to know, what your duty is in such a case. You have to be whip, huntsman, and everything else if you are the first man up. You get among the hounds and you lash them off, and you keep the brush and pads from being destroyed. Of course, Wat Danbury knew all about that, and he tried to force his mare through the trees to the place where all this hideous screaming and howling came from, but the wood was so thick that it was impossible to ride it. He sprang off, therefore, and left the mare standing alone, and broke his way through as best he could with his hunting lash ready over his shoulder. But as he ran forward, he felt his flesh go cold and creepy all over. He had heard hounds run into foxes many times before, but he had never heard such sounds as these. They were not the cries of triumph, but of fear. Every now and then there came the shrill yelp of mortal agony. Holding his breath, he ran on until he broke through the interlacing branches and found himself in a little clearing with the hounds all crowding around a patch of tangled bramble in the farther end. When he first caught sight of them, the hounds were standing in a half circle around this bramble patch, with their backs bristling and their jaws gaping. In front of the brambles lay one of them with his throat torn out, all crimson and white and tan. Wat came running out into the clearing, and at the sight of him the hounds took heart again, and one of them sprang with a growl into the bushes. At the same instant a creature the size of a donkey jumped onto its feet, a huge grey head, with monstrous glistening fangs and a tapering fox-like jaw, shot out from among the branches, and the hound was thrown several feet into the air, and fell howling among the cover. Then there was a sharp clashing snap like a rat trap closing, and the howl sharpened into a scream and then was still. Danbury had been on the lookout for the symptoms all day, and now he had found them. He looked once more at the thicket, and saw a pair of savage red eyes fixed upon him, and he fairly took to his heels. It might only be a passing delusion, or it might be a permanent mania of which the doctor had spoken, but anyhow the thing to do was to get back to bed and to quiet, and to hope for the best. He forgot the hounds and the hunt, and everything else in his desperate fears for his own reason. He sprang upon his mare, and he galloped her madly over the downs, and only stopped when he found himself at a country station. There he left his mare at the inn, and made back for home as quickly as the steam would take him. It was evening before he got there, shivering with apprehension, and seeing those red eyes and savage teeth at every turn. He went straight to bed and sent for Dr. Middleton. "I've got them, doctor," said he. "It came about exactly as you said. Strange creatures, optical delusions and everything. All I ask you now is to save my reason." The doctor listened to his story and was shocked as he heard it. "It appears to be a very clear case," said he. "This must be a lesson to you for life." "Never a drop again if only I come safely through this," cried Wat Danbury. "Well, my dear boy, if you will stick to it, that may prove a blessing in disguise. But the difficulty in this case is to know where the fact ends and the fancy begins. You see, it is not as if there is only one delusion. There have been several. The dead dogs, for example, must have been one as well as the creature in the bush. I saw it all as clearly as I see you. One of the characteristics of this form of delirium is that what you see is even clearer than reality. I was wondering whether this whole run was not a delusion also." Wat Danbury pointed towards his hunting boots still lying upon the floor, flecked with the splashings of the 2 counties. Well, that looks real, certainly. No doubt in your weak state you overexerted yourself and so brought this attack upon yourself. Well, whatever the cause, our treatment is clear. You will take the soothing mixture which I will send to you, and we shall put 2 leeches upon your temples tonight to relieve any congestion of the brain." So Wat Danbury spent the night in tossing about and reflecting what a sensitive thing this machinery of ours is, and how very foolish it is to play tricks with what is so easily put out of gear and so difficult to mend. And so he repeated and repeated his oath that this first lesson should be his last, and from that time forward he would be a sober, hard-working yeoman, as his father had been before him. So he lay tossing and still repentant, when his door flew open in the morning, and in rushed the doctor with a newspaper crumpled up in his hand. "My dear boy," he cried, "I owe you 1,000 apologies. You are the most ill-used lad, and I the greatest numbskull in the country. Listen to this." And he sat down upon the side of the bed, and flattened out his paper upon his knee, and began to read. The paragraph was headed, "Disaster to the Ashcombe Hounds," and it went on to say that 4 of the hounds, shockingly torn and mangled, had been found in Winton Fir Wood upon the South Downs. The run had been so severe that half the pack were lamed, but the 4 found in the wood were actually dead, although the cause of their extraordinary injuries was still unknown. "So you see," said the doctor, looking up, "that I was wrong when I put the dead hounds among the delusions." "But the cause?" cried Watt. "Well, I think that we may guess the cause from an item which has been inserted just as the paper went to press. Late last night, Mr. Brown of Smithers Farm, to the east of the Hastings, perceived what he imagined to be an enormous dog worrying one of his sheep. He shot the creature, which proves to be a grey Siberian wolf, of the variety known as Lupus giganticus. It is supposed to have escaped from some travelling menagerie. And that's the story, gentlemen. And Wat Danbury stuck to his good resolutions, for the fright which he had cured him of all wish to run such a risk again, and he never touches anything stronger than lime juice. At least he hadn't before he left this part of the country, 5 years ago next Lady Day.